Welcome back to Turning Hard Times to Good Times. I am your host, Jay Taylor, and I'm really happy to have with me once again Danielle DiMartino Booth. She is perhaps best known these days as a commentator on the Federal Reserve policy at places like CNBC, Fox Business, and Bloomberg, and she has had considerable experience on Wall Street in the past with Donaldson, Lufkin, Generette years ago, Credit Suisse, and also she was a financial columnist at Dallas Morning News, and also, of course, most recently, spending some 9 years as a key advisor to Richard Fisher at the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. So, and she's also written a book that, this is how I learned to know her, Fed Up, the book Fed Up, which is an excellent read, and I would strongly suggest it to my listeners that they get a copy of it and read it. It was written a couple of years ago, but it's still, I think, very apropos to what's going on. So that is, would also suggest that you consider signing up for her Daily Feather letter, which I have done. It's excellent. If you really consider yourself to be a serious investor, one who wants to understand what's going on in the markets, that is a must-read from my point of view. It's dmartinobooth.com, dmartinobooth.com to sign up, learn more about her service, and sign up for that service. So thank you for joining me again, Danielle.
So happy to be here today.
Happy to have you. I've titled today's show, "Why Do Central Bank Counterfeiters Like Gold?" And as we discussed before we went on the show, that central bankers cannot be counterfeiters, because counterfeiters, by definition, are people that break the law and create money outside of the law. And central bankers, of course, operate within the law. My argument is that, in essence, mechanically, central banks are doing much the same thing. They're doing it legally, but they're doing much the same thing on a much larger scale than the mafia don is, who's creating illegal money out of his basement printing press or whatever. So that may sound argumentative. I don't mean to be. This is, I guess, something maybe Ron Paul would have said on this show years ago. But in any event, and the problem was that a few years ago you could have argued both sides. You could have engaged in a really heated debate on this subject, but today you really can't, because Jay Powell has broadcast to the world that beginning in May and ending in September, the effort to shrink the balance sheet will have failed, and that it will stop somewhere around 3.5. I would guess that it would be bigger, 3.6 trillion or so. So every dime that the Federal Reserve purchased in its quantitative easing years that it was not able to then unwind, as was promised by Ben Bernanke, as was promised by Janet Yellen, as was promised by autopilot Jay Powell, every dime that they cannot unwind is technical monetization of the debt, because if you can't get rid of it, then you've monetized it. Mm-hmm. So they can't go in reverse any longer. It's only one direction, right? More and more printing press money, which leads me to another question. Ben Bernanke, it was in chapter 18 of your book. You quoted Ben Bernanke, who said, one myth that's out there is that what we're doing is printing money. We're not printing money. Of course we're not. We're creating digits in computer systems, right? Or do you think Bernanke was just playing on the ignorance of the American people, 99% of whom have no understanding at all about how money is magically created?
Oh no, no, and this is actually going to be more disturbing. And I was on the inside at the time. Ben Bernanke believed what he was saying.
Uh-huh.
You're stepping over a cliff. You're embarking upon the biggest monetary experiment in the history of mankind, and you're telling yourself that you're going to give investors in the market something that they're going to enjoy, and that then when you want to go and take it away, that investors are going to welcome you with open arms and say, okay, you gave us the stimulus, you can have you can have your tightening, we'll put it in a beautiful box, and we'll seal it with a bow. Not how it happened.
Yeah, so I guess he was buying the Keynesian notion that you could actually stimulate growth and money, and things would be
humming along so well, interest rates would be rising, but nobody would care because there was so much affluence, so much cash flow, so many profits that could easily service the interest rates. That was the theory, right?
It indeed was a theory, and every single time, I can read the lips of the people on Bubble Vision every time the 10-year starts to flirt with 3%. I can read their lips. I don't even have to turn it off mute. I can hear them in concert saying rising interest rates are a reflection of a strengthening economy.
Yeah.
And I'm always like, let's see how long that lasts. And usually it lasts until around 3.25%, maybe even north of that, before all hell breaks loose and, you wake up one morning and you're the head of a central bank and you're like, oh, gee, we lost Turkey overnight, the whole country. Yeah. So, the myth of rising interest rates reflecting a strong economy is something that was created by modern-day central bankers who made investors and economies much too reliant on cheap money, such that now they cannot get off the morphine drip. It's despicable because people inside the Fed at the time knew what was happening, protested, and were told by mainly academics, we know what we're doing. We'll be able to unwind this experiment when the time comes. Don't you worry.
Certainly, your boss, Richard Fisher, was one of the few people that was objecting, especially after the first quantitative easing. I remember seeing him on television raising questions about the ability to exit this system, the QE. He seemed to have some insights. You must have as well, as an advisor to him.
I do count myself among one of his chief advisors, so he was getting some good guidance.
So he had an inkling that this wasn't going to be easy to unwind it, right?
Well, of course. I mean, we had seen in since 1987 when Alan Greenspan first intervened in functioning markets by leaking information to bond trading desks in the aftermath of the 1987 stock market crash. He began to leak information about Fed intentions to inject liquidity into the system in advance to bond trading desks on Wall Street. And people wonder why markets came roaring back after 1987. It's because Fed moral hazard, the Fed put, the Greenspan put, however you want to put it, that was born in the days that followed the 1987 stock market crash. And what Richard and I both knew was that every iteration, every cycle of lower for longer, you had to be lower for even longer to get the same bang for your monetary buck.
And we've certainly seen that because every bubble has gotten bigger and every interest rate levels, and each bubble, the interest rates levels have declined. And what happens when we go to zero or below zero? How is this going to play out, Danielle?
Well, I think Wall Street's already chit-chatting about it. This is cocktail party chatter, what the first round of quantitative easing is going to look like. Surely it's not going to be that $85 billion number that it was back in October of 2014, because times have changed, right? We need more digits. So, the running number right now is that they'll start at 100 or more billion per month, and that they can stop growing the balance sheet at 8 or 9 trillion. And these are the things that markets are seriously anticipating right now, which explains the stock market's resilience.
But there's only one direction for things, and I can't get my head around how it's going to end. And what starts to happen? I mean, of course, in Japan and in Germany, you have negative rates. I mean, how does the world function in a negative rate environment? How can free markets exist in a negative rate regime, and how can capital be allocated at all efficiently?
Well, I think we're hearing out of European banks that they have long since hit their pain threshold. They're having a very hard time staying in business in these types of environments. I think that's one of the reasons the European Central Bank has been lobbied so hard by the banks to find a way of letting them escape from this negative interest rate regime.
and the ECB is frightened of its own shadow and knows that it would probably take the country of Italy down under such scenarios if it was to try and raise interest rates. That's how much worse the situation gets if you allow the situation to go into negative interest rate territory. That's the flip side of it is that Germany makes money on its debt, on its national debt. It makes money.
It's incredible.
That's the flip side.
Yeah, it's incredible. On page 209 of your book, you mentioned a remark that Richard Fisher made to Ron Paul. Essentially, I'm paraphrasing, he said, don't spend your energy to end the Fed, because Ron had just written the book, End the Fed. Rather, use your resources to implement some fiscal rectitude back to the federal government. But I'm wondering how is that going to be done? Because I know that you, David Stockman, for example, as well, who's been on the show, believe that governments should just get tough. They should just start to be reasonable and realize that debt is going to destroy you over the longer run. But these politicians aren't really interested in the long run. They're interested in the next elections. And, of course, CEOs of companies are interested in the next quarter's earnings more than anything else. How on the earth, where is the discipline going to come from? Do you expect people just to be reasonable and learn and be educated and politicians all of a sudden start to deny the candy to their children, to their childish voters, or how's this going to work?
Oh gosh, are you asking me if a politician is going to be more fiscally conservative than a central banker? I'm just trying to make sure I've got the question down because I can't even. I just can't wrap my head around the concept. I mean, That's why when people blow up on my Twitter feed and they're like, "Oh my gosh, the Fed is going to start buying corporate bonds, or the Fed is going to start buying stocks," and you say to yourself, "God, that would take an act of Congress," and then you're like, "Oh wait, Congress would happily pass laws for the Fed to buy whatever it needed to buy to get them reelected. They have no spines."
Well, that's right. They have no spine, and they're just always looking for the easy way out. And so my question is, how in the world do we ever, like Richard Fisher was saying to Ron Paul, essentially, that don't waste your time trying to get rid of the Fed. And Ron would have gone back to a gold standard, something like that. I think he would favor. So how on the earth are we ever going to get back to fiscal rectitude, or is it going to be imposed on us by some calamity?
Now you're talking. And I hate, hyperbole. It's not my thing. But if you read the political tea leaves and you look at the demographics of the country and the sheer millions and millions of millennials who would be in favor of effectively printing money for the express purpose of financing fiscal little escapades, such as forgiving all student loans or health care for all or universal basic income.
Yeah,
if
or the new Green Deal
were to succeed, and they were to be able to contract out the Fed to just rev up the printing presses, I think that will result in an eventual loss of reserve currency status if we let it go that far. I pray God for my children's sake and their children's sake that we don't go there. That at some point somebody says, enough is enough, I don't want my grandchildren speaking Mandarin, and pushes back.
Well, losing reserve currency status is something that empires eventually do. It certainly seems to me it's very interesting that China and Russia, the countries primarily that are considered adversaries of the United States, are building up their gold reserves very dramatically. They're trying to find ways outside of the SWIFT system, outside of the Western banking system. They're setting up their own trading infrastructure, trying to protect themselves, as I understand it, hoping to get out of the dollar one way or another. China can't do it quickly, of course. Russia has reportedly sold most, if not all, of their treasuries and are buying gold. I'm just wondering, to what extent does the Federal Reserve think about those
I think that that same level of deniability that I described earlier when it comes to Bernanke, that Bernanke believed what his models were telling him, that they would be able to unwind quantitative easing as easily as they had wound it up. I believe that there's some semblance of that same naivete inside of central banks such that they don't feel that they will ever be threatened by anything that radicals talk about. And that's how they couch it. They couch it as being radical arguments, and that's what makes it that much more ironic when Jay Powell goes up in front of the Congress of the United States and he asks if he would advocate for modern monetary theory and says, absolutely not. Debt must have its limits. We can't just take on debt like drunken sailors. And you say to yourself, but at the same time, you're talking about more QE. What do you think is going to, what do you think planted the seed in the first place in the socialist politicians' minds in this country? If you hadn't have done QE to show them, to demonstrate the efficacy and the execution of MMT, in order to bail out Wall Street. Why on earth wouldn't politicians say, let's bail out Main Street for a change? But it is a very slippery slope.
Right. And a Trump presidency would be leaning in that direction as well. That is to bail out Main Street.
The thing is, if we have seen and heard calls for from people who are close to President Bush to lower interest rates by 0.5 percentage point, if President Trump himself is saying, I'm just as deserving as quantitative easing as my predecessor, he is, of course, referring back to September the 13th, 2016, when Ben Bernanke announced quantitative easing QE3, QE infinity within weeks of the presidential election. And Trump is saying, if it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander. If you, Joe Q. Fed, helped elect Obama, then helped reelect Obama, then why can't you help reelect me? Let's just all play by the same rules. As perverse as that whole thing sounded.
Yeah, I mean, it is perverse, but, and during the campaign, Trump was railing against the advantages that Obama had with low interest rates, and he decried that.
The Fed was blowing bubbles, and we needed higher interest rates, even though he was a debt guy. And it's, again, there's nothing quite like power that corrupts as absolutely as power. And I think that we've seen that with the unfortunate metamorphosis of Jay Powell, who, when he was a rookie in 2012, understood full well that QE would become habit-forming, quote, unquote, because that's the word that Jay Powell himself used.
Well, if Jay Powell goes in, and I know you were a fan of his until he pivoted, somebody like that understands, whereas Bernanke maybe didn't understand. He believed what he was taught in the universities, but Jay Powell was seeing things, I think, a little more clearly, I think. But now he recants or goes along with the program. Who's really calling the shots, Danielle? Is it just the fear of the markets and what's going to happen because we've gotten ourselves into such dire straits with so much debt?
Well, if you look at the exposure, if you look at the percentage of the economy that is now accounted for by household net worth of stocks versus household net worth of real estate, the fact that stocks are bigger in that picture than real estate is so unusual historically. 1968, 1999, these are the only two instances that household net worth in stocks was greater than what households owned in real estate. But it also tells you that this is when the economy is the most dependent upon the stock market hanging in there, literally. Because if it doesn't, it's going to take the whole economy down with it. So this is a self-fulfilling prophecy that is born of very misguided Fed policy that now it's not just investors who view QE and, as Powell said, as being habit-forming. It's the whole darned economy.
But to what extent is Congress really lording it over the Fed, or are there other factors? For example, I believe that the Fed is owned by the various district banks, right?
Well, it's a complicated answer, and I should answer this very, very, very carefully. The most powerful people at the Federal Reserve are in Washington, D.C. They're on the Federal Reserve Board. They have permanent votes on the Federal Open Market Committee. They are full-blown government employees. Their email addresses end in .gov. The district banks, the 12 district banks scattered throughout the country, have banks as shareholders in those district banks. They're paid something about a 6% dividend, if I'm not mistaken. As shareholders, they're paid a dividend out of the operating revenue of each individual Federal Reserve bank, after which point operating costs are covered, and every last penny after that is remitted to the U.S. Treasury. So as a district employee of the Dallas Fed, as I was, my email address ended in .org because we, the district banks were quasi-public-private entities. The reason I'm taking such pains to answer this question is because there's been a little bit of damage over the years by the creature from Jekyll Island. I probably just destroyed that book title name. But there's been a little bit of misinformation that's been put out there that the Federal Reserve is owned by bankers. Yes, in part, only in the districts, and those district presidents only get a vote every 3 years. The power seat is populated by government employees, and that needs to be known.
Okay, so the government has the main say in things, in the direction of the Fed, and it's easy to understand then because the politicians, they want to give their goodies, their candy to voters every 2 years at least, right?
Of course. I mean, that is the minute midterms came and went. It was fairly apparent that because there was so much gridlock baked into the cake, that each side of the aisle was just going to march off and start campaigning for the presidential campaign and not even try and pretend to legislate. So that is what our country's become.
All right, we're basically out of time here, so I have to ask you. Ron Paul's solution would be end the Fed and go back to some sort of a gold-backed monetary system, asset-based monetary system, rather than. And you would say to what to that suggestion?
I would say that it's not a practical solution. I think the Fed needs to be taken down to the studs. I think it needs to be populated by just a handful of academics, not 800 PhDs. And I think for the sake of national security, given what the Chinese would do to an unprotected financial system, if we were to end the Fed, if they can do what they've proven they can do to our intellectual property, I would hate to see what the Chinese could do to an unprotected banking system. So I'm just to the left of Ron Paul in his idea to end the Fed. I think we should upend the Fed.
Upend the Fed and populate it with just a handful, but I would hope they would be people that are practical enough, not just academics, but practical enough people that understand markets and preferably free markets.
Absolutely. Look at Professor Bob Shiller out of Yale University. There's a practical person. If I've ever, known one in my life, why wouldn't somebody like that be a much better candidate than somebody who's never actually visited planet Earth? Their passport's not even stamped.
All right. Very good. Thank you so much, Danielle, for being with us again. Always a pleasure. You're always a great, interesting guest.